Chapter 1. Here kitty kitty. Roxanne looked down at the kitten heels she wore that day, wishing she'd donned her steel-tipped work boots instead. Of course she'd wanted to look nice, sexy even. Despite working in a dilapidated trailer on the fringe of a dusty construction site near the edge of an undeveloped stretch of Memphis. Wearing a short black skirt and silky blue blouse with the top 2 buttons opened, she stood behind her messy desk, filled with blueprints and papers. Baxter, the county permit official, probably couldn't even see her feet anyway, she mused. She'd made sure to dress a little more provocative than usual that day, knowing Baxter was something of a flirt. She wanted to use that to her advantage to make sure he signed off on the new building permit her boss wanted without asking too many questions. Roxanne's boss, Danny, chief construction officer, admitted the county might not grant the permit because the new plans expanded the building site past the original demarcation the county had previously permitted. Usually Roxanne thought of herself as a woman who knew how to handle men, especially in such a male-dominated industry. Looking at Baxter across the desk, ogling her, she knew she made a mistake. When she tried to unfurl the plans and have Baxter look at them flat on her desk, she noticed how his eyes glanced at the blueprint and then fixated on her chest. Her long honey-colored hair grazed his hand before she smiled and tucked the thick tendrils behind her ear. So you see here we've expanded this. No big deal. Just need your signature, Roxanne said. What ya gonna do for it, honey? Baxter looked up, gazing at her like a man looking at the most recent copy of Lewd magazine. What do you want from me, Baxter? Roxanne said, turning her head to the side. You'd be helping me out. I'd owe you. She decided to play along to a point. She didn't think he'd actually go one step further. I'll sign it. Don't worry, darlin', he said. Darlin'. Yuck. She hated when men resorted to such sexist descriptions, but she needed this permit. She'd been out of work for way too long. When her boss, Danny, finally gave her a break and hired her as the construction manager on the job, Roxanne could finally pay her rent and help her dad pay his debt. The loan sharks weren't going to wait forever, no matter how much Roxanne promised. As Roxanne stood up, Baxter fumbled with the pen, and it fell on the floor next to the desk. Roxanne leaned over to pick it up, but before she completely lifted her head, she felt Baxter's hand on her butt. She'd gotten this treatment from guys before, particularly at bars her dad liked to frequent, trying to gamble money out of unsuspecting pool players. Normally, she'd just slap their hand away, sometimes throw a drink on them, but with Baxter she wasn't quite sure what to do. Roxanne decided to shrug it off. After he signed the permit, she placed it in a red folder to the side of her desk. She offered Baxter her hand as a friendly gesture. He grabbed it and pulled her in for a hug. She tried to push him away, but he wrapped his arms around her waist, pressing himself into her. She closed her eyes, bracing herself. When she felt his hot breath like the steam from a coffee cup approach her lips, she jerked her head away. Ah, come on now, Baxter said. I just wanted a little thank you is all. Still holding her close, Roxanne tried to wriggle out of his grasp. She couldn't stand his touch for one more second. It's just, you know, she half smiled. I don't want to ruin our professional relationship. Don't worry, honey. You ain't ruin anything. Just give me one kiss. Roxanne leaned her head back as far as she could limbo and pushed Baxter away. Please, she said. Don't touch me. Thanks to her workout routine, she had the strength to push him away. Oh, now come on. I'm just being friendly. Just a little kiss wouldn't hurt. Roxanne stepped toward the door, trying to consider if a kiss was indeed all Baxter was after. She saw his face, stubble prickling his chin, staring at her chest, and she couldn't just play along anymore. Even though it might cost her in the end, she couldn't bring herself even to pretend to be interested in a middle-aged huckster like Baxter who used his authority to prey on women. Roxanne knew there weren't many women in her line of work. As a construction site manager, she oversaw the plans and materials for various building projects. Most of the time this job went to men. Roxanne, having learned about construction at a young age from her father, who worked on various building sites, eventually landing some gigs as a foreman, she knew more than just how to hammer in a nail. As a teenager, she worked summers alongside her father, expertly leveling joists and assembling beams. When men on those construction sites hit on her, which they did all the time due to Roxanne's ample bosom and hourglass figure, she'd usually smirk or whistle back, never letting the attention derail her from the job at hand. Once they saw her wield a nail gun or power through a demolition with a mallet in hand, they'd usually back off. Baxter, however, looked intent on getting what he came for. He grabbed her wrist as she lurched toward the door, and pulled her close, almost smacking his lips into her face. Roxanne pulled out of his grasp at the last second and slapped his cheek. She had to do more than whistle back that time. So that's how you want to play it? He smiled and grabbed her shoulders, as if it were some type of game. She stared at the shiny red wallop on his face for a second before opening the door to escape. Baxter's cheek almost matched the color of the folder Roxanne glanced at across her desk. The folder containing the signed permit. She hesitated before deciding she would leave it, get it later. Let go of me. She stomped on Baxter's foot with the sharp part of her heel, feeling vindicated that her shoe choice came in handy after all. No means no. She scampered out the door into the late afternoon sun to her car as fast as she could in her little heels, the dust kicking up behind her. Baxter stared after her, walking to his truck. She looked back and felt satisfied he wasn't going to follow her. As she scurried to her car, a beat-up old sedan, her heel hit a stone and a piece of it broke off. She hobbled the last 3 steps to her car, Baxter chuckling after her approaching his truck. She'd gotten his signature and hopefully she wouldn't need any more favors. She knew it was always good to have local support for a building project, but she just couldn't stand someone pawing at her. Suggestive comments were one thing, playing grab hands was another. She definitely miscalculated Baxter's determination. Everything would be fine, she told herself. Glancing at her face in the visor mirror, she reflected on her overall good looks. Sometimes they got her into trouble and sometimes they got her out. She'd never relied on her beauty, and she wasn't about to start. Her strengths commonly included being able to relate to men, act tough but not uptight. As her little car turned off the dirt road toward the city, she could hear the loud engine of Baxter's truck. Guys with little self-esteem often seem to gravitate toward hulking machinery, she thought. She planned to drive around the block, down by the edge of the Mississippi River before heading back, leaving enough time for Baxter to be long gone, and she could safely store the signed permit. She'd have to file it with the County Building Commission in the morning. Driving down the road, she considered how if she ran into Baxter again. Shivering at the idea, she'd need to smooth things over. She couldn't risk getting a bad reputation with any county officials. She needed her job to stay intact. Her future as a building site manager depended on it, and so did her father's life. Chapter 2 Meet and Greet. Driving down the highway, the rolling river on her right, Roxanne considered her next move. She had to get back to her office and get the permit so she could submit it first thing tomorrow morning, hopefully, before Baxter had time to change his mind. He wasn't the only one who worked in the permit office, so if she submitted it for processing before Baxter could sour the deal, she'd be fine. At least she'd be able to keep her boss off her back. She was grateful for the job after a long stint of being unemployed. Her last position as a building manager ended in turmoil after the building collapsed. It hadn't been her fault, a slew of miscalculations by the foreman and architect, but that didn't stop the onslaught of blame that came her way. Her reputation as a reliable building site manager vanished. Everyone associated with that project had been basically blacklisted. For months she grumbled on her father's couch, having given up her apartment to save money. It was probably what made her dad accelerate his gambling, causing him to owe a local loan shark thousands due to his desperate blunder. Her dad had always been game for a hustle, but it had mostly been small games, cards, pool, the occasional horse racing bet. Roxanne's mom left when she was 3, in part due to her own addictions, so Roxanne grew up with her dad who taught her everything he knew about construction. He took great care of her and they were close. So he took it pretty hard when Roxanne couldn't find work, retired himself due to an injury. His gambling escalated to make ends meet. Roxanne begged him to stop, told him she just needed a little time to get back on her feet, but he wouldn't listen. He swore each bet was a sure thing, and she hadn't realized how bad it had actually gotten until it was too late. The only thing Roxanne couldn't stand watching more than beauty pageants was seeing her dad wallow at home, after another sobering loss at poker or horse racing, or whatever vice he was using to gamble that day. It was an addiction and a dangerous one. Being the kind of girl who doesn't give up, she started picking up odd jobs with contractors. When a newbie working on a house flip with her mentioned a developer he knew who was starting a new project, Roxanne did her research. She found out the developer needed a little more seed money, which Roxanne agreed to get in exchange for hiring her as building site manager. With so much riding on making the building project a success, both for her career and for her father's safety, Roxanne needed things to go smoothly, and that included filing the building permits. It was dusk by the time she pulled back into the dirt-covered road leading to her trailer on the edge of the building site. With the sun setting in the distance, she noticed 2 vehicles parked nearby. At first she thought they might be associated with Baxter, but then she realized he was probably at the bar licking his wounds. As she drove up, slowly inching toward the vehicles, she noted one looked like her boss pickup. The other was a pristine white luxury SUV that appeared as if it had just been driven off the lot. She really hoped she could just run into her trailer, Get the folder and jet. She didn't feel like having a conversation. Not that day. She particularly hoped the SUV did not belong to the loan shark her dad owed. After finding out about the building project, she groveled to the loan shark and promised him a big return on his investment if he put money into the real estate deal, plus a substantial part of her paycheck every month to pay down her father's debt, plus interest. He agreed to invest the money and take her payments. However, he warned Roxanne that if he lost his investment or she couldn't make the payments, her father would suffer. When she stepped out of her beat-up car, she was relieved to see it wasn't the loan shark. Standing next to her boss was a tall, impeccably dressed man in shiny leather shoes staring back at her. In fact, he stared so hard and stood rim-rod straight it startled her. He was good-looking, clean-cut, not a hair out of place but not her type. Too square. Too uptight. She squirmed under his watchful eye as she walked toward them, and for the second time that afternoon, she wished she hadn't worn those kitten heels. "Roxy," called Danny as he waved her over, stubbing his cigarette out on the pebbled ground. "What's up?" she said, stepping slowly, trying not to look too wobbly on the broken heel. "What's wrong with you?" Danny asked, looking down at her feet. She slouched on one hip, trying to look cool. "It's nothing. She stuttered. "I was just getting that permit and—" "Oh yeah, the permit. Good old Baxter. How's he doing? I know he likes to sign those things in person, especially with you." He gave her a grin and a knowing nod. "Yeah, good old Baxter." She swung her arm like Popeye, giving a wink. "Who's your friend?" she asked, nodding toward the mystery man. "Yeah, I'd like you to meet Tom," Danny said. Tom reached out his arm in a stiff offering, robotic and emotionless. Roxanne hesitated for a second before shaking his hand. Unlike his static demeanor, his hand felt soft and warm. It surprised her for a second, and then the moment vanished as Tom mechanically retracted his hand, face still stoic. "He's a real estate developer. Thinking about doing a project with me. I was giving him a tour of the site. This is Roxanne, the site manager for this job." Roxanne smiled at Tom, but he just acknowledged her with a perfunctory nod of his head. "Looking for another lady for kickball this week. We're up against those downtown office snobs. I hate those pricks. You in?" Danny asked Roxanne. "Definitely," she said. "I need to take their first baseman down. He said I kick like a girl. You play." She nodded toward Tom. She could tell he wasn't the kickball type, but she wanted to see how he'd answer. By this point he hadn't spoken a word. "No," was all he said, blinking once and continuing to stand rimrod straight. "It's a lot of fun. You should join us. With long legs like yours you look like you'd be a great kicker," she said, trying to flatter him. She usually knew how to put guys at ease, engage in small talk. "I never thought of that, but I don't have the best aim," he replied, still looking past Roxanne, not meeting her eyes. "Well, that just takes practice. A lot can be overcome with practice," Roxanne said, smirking due to a memory. "Just something my dad always said." Tom turned slightly toward her and looked in Roxanne's eyes. When he smiled, only slightly, Roxanne felt a brief moment of relief, as if she'd finally cracked a secret code. It was then, after he smiled, that she recognized Tom from television. He was part of a famous real estate family in the area she had seen once on the news. They had just built a big new office building downtown. Why he would want to do a deal with Danny, Roxanne couldn't fathom. Danny seemed like a good guy, but not into the kinds of projects she imagined Tom would be interested in. From what Roxanne remembered, somehow Tom seemed to smile more on TV. Maybe he just needed a camera on him to show emotion. But that smile, that little glimpse of an upturned lip, made Roxanne want more of it. Somehow, she'd have to get him to do it again. If for no other reason than to amuse herself that she could infuse a robot with some humanity. "So what are you into, Tom? Besides real estate, what are your hobbies?" she asked. "I didn't come prepared for a personal interview," he said, again not looking at Roxanne. "Oh yeah, I didn't mean to interrogate you, just making conversation. Seeing if we have anything in common." "We don't," Tom said, cutting her off. Roxanne frowned and looked down, again regretting her shoe choice because she wanted to scamper away. Tell these guys she needed to get home. It was the second time that day she'd tried to play the buddy card. First with Baxter, which turned out horrific, and then with Tom, which wasn't going smoothly either. Having worked so closely with men for so many years, she usually got along well with them. She wasn't sure where she went wrong. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean any offense. I just like to keep my personal life personal. Please understand," Tom said. Roxanne looked up and saw him searching her face for some type of release. Some indication that she wasn't totally pissed at him. "No, it's okay. I better get going. Got some stuff to do," she said, a little unsure what to say next, wanting to extricate herself from the conversation. Meeting your pops at the hole in the wall? Danny asked, referring to a bar Roxanne and some of the other construction crew frequented. Nah, not tonight. Think I'll just lay low tonight, Roxanne said. It was nice meeting you, Roxanne. Tom dipped his head toward her, the words coming out of his lips sounding more like a platitude than a sincere statement. You too, Tom. Roxanne considered how bizarre he seemed, not completely comfortable with strangers, she supposed. At the same time, Roxanne replayed the warm, gentle feeling of his hand against hers. As the two men turned to walk away, Roxanne watched before tottering toward her trailer. She had more pressing issues to worry about than whether she could make Danny's new investor friend smile. After what she'd been through with Baxter, she knew she should focus on her job so she could pay her rent and keep the loan shark at bay. And yet she couldn't shake the brief spark she felt when she managed to elicit a smile from Tom. It was a feeling she could get addicted to. The conflicting feelings she had about Tom were soon forgotten, however, for when she opened the squeaky door to her trailer, her mouth fell open in disgust. Chapter 3 Night Stalker. She gasped seeing her desk and the floor around it littered with papers and folders. Cabinet drawers were left open with office supplies such as staples and pens cluttering the shelves. The office didn't appear ransacked, at least not entirely. Instead, it seemed as if someone had been looking for something in a hurry, and left a flurry of folders and documents in their wake. Surprised to find her office pillaged, Roxanne's first thought was to look for the permit. Amongst the pile of folders on her desk, she searched for a red one. She found two. Diamen, she said when she opened the first one and saw it contain some old invoices. When she grabbed the next red folder in her hand, she just knew it wasn't the one containing the permit, based on its weight, heavy with insurance documents. Diamen, she said again, frantically tossing things around her desk and opening drawers. She usually kept the paperwork fairly orderly. It was one area where she excelled compared to many of her male counterparts in the construction industry. Ah, she screamed. Where is it? She started to look faster, tossing papers aside, checking the same places twice. She quickly twisted her hair into a ponytail from her desk drawer, eager to keep it out of her face so she could continue searching. But none of the drawers or folders contained the permit. To her surprise, nothing else seemed to have been stolen. Looking around, she couldn't understand why someone would break in to steal the permit. Maybe Baxter had taken it out of spite? But no, she remembered him walking out and heading to his truck, the loud revving of the engine as she peeled out of the dirt drive ahead of him. She didn't think he had driven back to take it. Roxanne took off her broken shoe and threw it at the door. If she couldn't find the permit, she'd be screwed. It could put the construction timeline and design at risk, costing money. The loan shark investors wouldn't be happy. And Danny just might fire her since she already told him Baxter had signed the permit. Should she go to the police? Naturally, she knew that was the last thing her unsavory investors and even many in the construction crew would want. Some men in blue sniffing around a construction site, getting in their business. No, she couldn't go to the police. It would make sense for her to go back to Baxter, explain what happened. And then she thought about Baxter pawing her, his eyes greedy on her body. She took off her other shoe and hurled it at the door too. She couldn't go back to Baxter. Not yet anyway. Roxanne started to cry, sitting in her chair, her head down at her desk with the tornado of papers surrounding her. Things had been going pretty well on the construction site over the last 3 months. Early preparations were running on time. They'd had no accidents. There was the occasional dispute about overtime or materials charges, but nothing Roxanne couldn't handle. Then the architects had made a crucial change to the plans, and they needed this new permit. Of course, Roxanne had thought it would be a breeze. She had planned to entice Baxter to sign the permit and get the job done. No problem. She just hadn't anticipated Baxter's overzealous advances. She wiped her mascara-stained eyes and sat up. Who would want to sabotage her? Or maybe it wasn't personal. Maybe it was another group trying to stall or prevent the building project. But who? Roxanne knew she needed to find out. She sat up a little straighter, thinking that she didn't need the police or Baxter. What she needed was to find out who stole the permit and make them pay. She bit her lower lip considering her next move. No one messed with Roxanne Gary and got away with it. Resolved to find who was responsible, Roxanne cleaned up her paper-strewn desk and stacked the files neatly in their drawers. Obviously, whoever it was knew what they were looking for, they just didn't know where it was, hence the mess. Hopefully, she could put Danny off for a few days and buy some time to figure things out. Normally, she was good with research. She felt confident she could find the culprit in a few days if she knew where to look. And she knew just the person to ask. She grabbed one of the empty folders, thinking she might need it to store any information she collected. Still pissed about the turn of events, yet feeling better about her plan, she picked up her shoes and walked outside barefoot. Stepping on the pebble dirt felt slightly uncomfortable on her feet, but she didn't care. The sky dark, the moon only a sliver of a crescent offering little light, she tiptoed towards her car, vowing never to wear heels to work again. Once she walked closer, she noticed a tall dark figure emerge from the other side of her car. After the day she'd had, Roxanne felt anxious and on edge. Her stomach flipped, and just as she was about to scream and run the other way, she stopped as she recognized who the Night Stalker. Chapter 4: The Grin. "It's a nice night, isn't it, Roxanne?" asked a voice, quiet but strong. "Oh, Tom. Gosh, you scared me." She brought her hand up to her chest, feeling her heart pounding. "Sorry. I just like being out at night when it's quiet." "I'm sure you do. You don't happen to suck people's blood, do you? Because then I'm going to have to put my shoes on and run. And I'd really rather not do that." She looked at him as a small shard of light from the moon lit one side of Tom's face. He smirked. Oh, that smile. Roxanne could see a slight rise in his cheek. She breathed in, feeling warm from Tom's subtle show of emotion. "I'm not a vampire, if that's what you mean. I just prefer things less crowded." He looked at Roxanne, trying to find her eyes. "I know what you mean. My dad and I used to climb to the top of whatever building he was working on after everyone had left the site. Sometimes we'd be so high up, we could nearly touch the stars. Your father taught you everything you know, I heard." He turned toward her, his hands firmly at his side. "Yeah, I'm much better in a pair of boots, holding a hammer than I am in these heels and this skirt." She held up her shoes a little higher. Tom looked her over without moving his head or any part of his body. Roxanne thought his stillness in the dark light seemed eerie. He was in control of his every move, no matter how slight. She longed to see him relax because his rigidity put her on edge. There was something disconcerting about him, yet also alluring. She found him intriguing, odd. He was certainly different than the construction guys she usually hung out with. "You have the permit in there?" He pointed to the folder Roxanne was holding. "This?" She didn't know how to respond. She couldn't tell him the truth. He'd go straight to Danny and her jig would be up. She curled the toes of her right foot under, thinking of what to say. "Yeah, it's I have to submit it tomorrow and all. Don't you need the plans too?" he asked, referring to the blueprints Baxter had signed off on. "It's just She needed a way to lighten him up, get him to stop grilling her. "I wasn't prepared for a personal interview," she said, standing up straight, repeating Tom's response from earlier. "Fair enough," he said, broadening both lips in an upturned grin. She'd done it. His smile caused her to forget her troubles in that instance, and she smiled back. Without proper footwear, knowing her makeup was a wreck, her hair a mess, all she could think about was garnering one more friendly reaction from Tom. "I'm headed to the hole in the wall after all. Do you want to come for a drink?" She surprised herself that she so quickly thought of the idea and immediately belted out the invitation. "There's a patio out back. Not so many people." She wasn't sure why she asked him. She hadn't even been on a date in over 2 years since losing her job, having also lost her interest in men. For some reason she wanted something to distract her that night, even if Tom wasn't her usual type. A drink at the bar wasn't a real date anyway, she reasoned. She thought of a night at the bar with Tom as more of a science experiment, figuring out what made him tick. Tom brought his arm up to his face in a jerky motion. He studied the watch on his wrist and just as reflexively, returned his arm to his side. "Yes, I have the time." It wasn't quite the answer she'd been seeking, but maybe she could get to know this Tom a little better, pry him open a bit. Plus there was someone at the bar she needed to talk to. With Tom accompanying her, it wouldn't look like she just came for answers. They drove separately and agreed to meet at the door. Throwing on a sweatshirt she had in the car, covered in crumbs from the numerous meals she ate on the run, Roxanne felt more comfortable. She started walking toward the bar where she could see Tom standing straight and still. While the tourists visited Beale Street in Memphis, a strip of bars and restaurants known for hard partying much like Bourbon Street in New Orleans, the locals liked to hang out a few blocks east. Roxanne walked toward Tom as he opened the door to the bar, light darting across the dark sidewalk. "You lead," he said, his eyes scanning the room. She stepped inside and continued to walk toward the back of the bar, twice glancing back to make sure Tom was following behind her. Roxanne didn't think it possible for Tom to look any more uncomfortable. Once they entered the dim interior, Tom's eyes darted around, taking in every inch of the scene. "Hey, Roxy." A group of old men drinking pints waved at her from their bar stools on the far side of the bar. "Hey," she said back. "Seen my dad?" One of the men tilted his head, indicating the pool tables across the room. Roxanne looked over and sighed. There was her father, chalking a pool cue, clearly in the middle of a game with two young college students, their blue University of Memphis hoodies indicating their status. She made a note to come back and make sure her dad wasn't trying to sucker some poor college kids. Come on, she indicated to Tom as she continued to walk down a narrow hallway. A waitress stepping out of the bathroom said, "Hi Rox. Ungia. A lager when you get a chance and..." She turned toward Tom. "What do you want to drink?" "I'll take a glass of white wine." Roxanne turned back to the waitress. "A beer and a white wine. We'll be out back." "Thanks, Angie." Roxanne continued to lead Tom down the hallway, and then out a doorway that led to a square concrete slab. White lights strung up by a pole in each corner illuminated the 4 tables on the patio. No one else was sitting outside as Roxanne walked up to one of the chairs. Tom pulled it out and offered it to her before she could sit down. She crossed her legs and her toes dangled in the air. Even though it was April, the night air felt a little chilly to Roxanne. She shivered. "I guess men usually offer women their coats when they get cold." "I don't know what to do about your feet," said Tom. "Oh, don't worry about it. I'll be fine. I'd rather have cold toes than wear those heels another minute." Angie arrived carrying their drinks and placed them on the table. "Thanks, Angie," said Roxanne. Tom gave his signature nod. Roxanne grabbed her beer bottle and gulped down half of its contents. She was still seething about what happened with Baxter and the missing permit. Even though she tried not to think about it, her mind kept replaying the scene between herself and Baxter. She wished she just punched him in the balls after he grabbed her butt. Maybe then she wouldn't be in this predicament. Tom took a sip of his wine, bringing the glass to his lips and then lightly setting it back on the table. Roxanne watched his movements, careful but gentle. "Not to grill you on the personal, Tom, but what's with the project with Danny? What are you looking to do?" "Oh, nothing much. Just some stores." He kept his hand on his glass, swirling around its contents. Roxanne took another big swig of her beer. She knew Tom was being vague, but she couldn't blame him. Real estate was a tough world with developers trying to outbid each other for land and vying for building permission or changes to zoning laws. "Really? A man like you from a wealthy real estate family looking to build a couple stores with Danny? Whatever you say." She understood why he'd want to keep the details of his project secret. She also wanted him to know he wasn't fooling her. Tom scowled. In contrast to the little light that flickered inside her at Tom's slight smile, his scowl made her shudder. He looked incensed, even more uptight than usual, if that was even possible. She thought it would be fun to play with Tom a little, like a game trying to get him to unlock. She realized she'd been wrong. Tom's look plainly sent the signal that Roxanne should tread lightly. Clearly, she wasn't having much luck with men that day. She wondered how she could turn things around. She slung back her beer, and before she could apologize, a huge smile spread across Tom's face, and Roxanne couldn't understand. Chapter 5 That Darn Cat. Roxanne knew the smile wasn't because of something she'd said. She followed Tom's gaze and saw a gray kitten licking some trash by the fence on the edge of the patio. That's what had made Tom smile? A kitten? She could hardly believe he'd be a cat person. "I'm sorry about accusing you of lying. I'm just sick of dealing with men's BS today." He didn't appear to hear her, lost in his thoughts, gazing at the kitten. Tom continued to watch the young cat paw at an empty carton. After a few licks, a loud bang in the distance startled it, and it disappeared, vanishing into the dark night. "You like cats?" she asked. Tom continued to stare into the darkness, seeming to search for the cat. "I like how they don't need people. Well, mostly anyway. Give them some food, water, or don't like that cat." He found his own food. Then he turned his gaze on Roxanne. "I'm looking to do things on my own. Choose my own projects." Roxanne took another sip of her beer and nodded in understanding. "I want to be my own man, not just live on the coattails of my mother and father." "Understood." She put down her empty bottle. "I'm going to get another beer. Want anything?" She glanced at his glass, noticing he'd barely sipped any of it. "No, thank you." Roxanne got up and walked through the bar. She felt the emotional weight of the day sink her shoulders. Trying to elicit a slight smile out of Tom felt like a lot of work, and she needed a break before getting to the real reason she came to the bar that night. First, however, she needed to check in with her dad. As she scanned the bar, she saw him sitting by his friends in their usual corner. "Roxy, I see you don't abide by the old saying, no shirt, no shoes, no service," her dad said. She looked down at her feet and wiggled her toes. "No, Pop, I figured I'd let my piggies breath." He gave her a skeptical look, and took a sip from his pint. "Everything all right?" He looked her over. She knew she probably appeared disheveled, but she'd wiped off her makeup in the car and shook her hair out. There was the fact that she was in a miniskirt, sweatshirt and bare feet. However, it was more likely her expression that told her father something was wrong. Everything's fine. She lied. Did you screw those college boys out of some loose change? She asked. He looked at his friends and took another sip of beer. It was just a friendly game. I was showing them some tricks. Roxanne didn't believe him. Dad, you know you can't gamble anymore. Especially here. Owen won't have it. Honey, I swear. It was like a lesson. The two guys next to her father chuckled. Yeah, you schooled them all right, one of the men said. Look, I've got a friend here I have to get back to. I have some more work to do after, but don't worry about me. I've got it covered. She leaned over and kissed her dad on the cheek. Before leaving the bar, she ordered 2 shots of tequila. If the wine wasn't going to loosen Tom up, maybe hard liquor could do the trick. She wanted to let loose a little before dealing with her mess. As she brought back the tequila, she noticed a young couple canoodling at the outside table in the corner. Tom looked even more uncomfortable than when he'd first arrived with Roxanne. Get a room, Roxanne bellowed. She sat down and passed a shot glass to Tom. I don't drink liquor. Roxanne noticed his wine glass was only half empty. Apparently you don't drink much at all. She tilted her head back and swallowed her tequila. Come on. Loosen up. Tom sat up straighter, which Roxanne didn't even think was possible. If you haven't noticed, I don't do loose, he said. Roxanne grabbed the tequila in front of Tom and swallowed its contents too. Sorry, but it seems I need more liquor. If Tom wasn't going to help her relax, she figured she'd best get on with her plan. She usually didn't drink quite so much at one time, and since she hadn't eaten much that day, the alcohol was having quite an effect on her. Feeling a little woozy, she steadied herself on the back of the chair, then stumbled forward. Now that she felt emboldened by the liquor, she had the courage to attend to her business. She walked into the bar and instead of walking into the women's room, she entered the men's. On the door of the last stall was a sign that read, out of order. She pushed open the door and took 2 steps to the back wall, where she found a small knob and turned it to enter a secret door in the back of the stall. Behind the secret bathroom entryway was a dim office, with a large wooden desk in the center lit by a floor lamp and a few filing cabinets to the side. A man about 75, older than Roxanne's father, perched behind the desk. 3 computer monitors sat on the wall in front of him, one trained on the front door, one on the interior of the bar, the other on the patio. Without looking up, the old man asked, Who's the stiff? Just some guy my boss is wooing. Some real estate investor, Roxanne said, approaching the desk. Be careful. The man still didn't look up, intent on examining the paper on his desk. Of course. I'm always careful. The man stopped and looked up, flashing Roxanne a doubtful stare. Okay, I mean usually. I thought I could have some fun with him, but he's a tough one to crack. She rolled her eyes. Usually means they want to stay locked. The man went back to looking at his desk. Listen, Owen, I need to ask you a favor. Roxanne bit her lower lip, hoping he would help her. I don't have any money. We've been through this. I love your pop, but he's got a vice he has to deal with. It's not that. It's something else. Owen sighed and took off his glasses, placing them on the desk and looking up at Roxanne. He spread out his hands, indicating she should continue. You know how I'm working for Danny and his crew trying to pay off my dad's debt? Owen nodded. Well, something weird happened today. Owen tilted his head a little to the side. Someone broke into my trailer and stole a permit. A permit? Why didn't you file it? See, that's the thing. I couldn't. I had the county official sign off on the permit. I had to leave, and when I came back it was gone. Baxter? Owen asked, sat back in his chair and crossed his arms. Roxanne nodded, then turned her head and watched Tom sip his wine on the screen. Someone wants to sabotage the project, or you, he said. Right. She nodded, eager to agree. You need to find out which one. He leaned forward, put his glasses back on and returned to looking at the paper in front of him. But how do I know? How do I find out? She hiccuped, the tequila definitely making its presence known. Should I go to the cops? Don't go to the cops. Owen started to write something on a slip of paper. Here. He handed her the slip. Roxanne noted it had an address written on it. Go there. Roxanne felt relieved. Owen was willing to help her and not yell at her or throw her out of the bar. She'd known him for years, and she didn't want to disappoint him. And wear shoes, he said, still looking at the paper on his desk. She thought he hadn't noticed, then remembered nothing got by Owen. That's how he stayed in business so long. She thanked him and ducked out of his office. While she was eager to see where Owen was sending her, she could tell things were going nowhere with Tom. She needed to wrap things up with him, and then move on to figuring out her more pressing issue with the permit. Her dad was relying on her. With Tom's fancy wine and feline-loving ways, Roxanne didn't think they would ultimately make a good match anyway. While she enjoyed the electric spark she felt when he smiled at her or touched her hand, his stiff and odd demeanor bothered her. Plus, she needed to focus on more important things or both she and her dad would be in Chapter 6 on a mission. Once she got back to the table, Tom's wine glass was 3/4 empty. She picked it up and swallowed the last swig. Tom frowned but didn't say anything as she sat down. She realized she was as hungry as that feral cat they'd seen, but apparently not as amusing to Tom. She looked at her phone and ordered a rideshare. "I've got to go," she said and stood up, almost falling over and catching herself on the table as she lurched toward Tom. He stood up and tried to hoist her arm around his shoulder, but he was too tall. Instead, he steadied her with his hand on her elbow. Again, his touch gave her a brief moment of euphoria. His hand felt firm and comforting, leading her through the hallway and across the bar room. Her father jumped up, but Roxanne waved him away. "I'm fine, Dad. I ordered a ride." "Okay, sweetie." He stepped toward her and whispered in her ear. "Just say the word, and I'll give this guy the ol' heave-ho." Roxanne gave her father a pat on the back and again insisted she was fine. She waved to her father's friends along with Angie, the waitress. Outside, the cool air sobered Roxanne a bit after walking through the sweaty bar. Tom let go and she stood on her own. Brushing back her hair, she looked up at Tom's face. He wore a new expression. It wasn't a smile or disdain. That time it was concern. "Are you going to be all right? I can drive you." "Thanks, but I'm swell. I've got something to do." Her car pulled up along the curb. Tom opened the door and she scooted in. As she pulled away, she almost regretted not taking Tom up on his offer to drive. In the end, he acted the perfect gentleman, and although he was hard to read, he'd been kind enough to help. But she'd been independent for far too long, and wherever Owen was sending her, she needed to go alone. Plus, while there were a brief few moments she enjoyed being with Tom, he mostly made her feel puzzled. She instructed the driver to take her to a convenience store first, where she picked up a snack of beef jerky and pretzels. Although she sometimes scarfed down snack food, Roxanne managed to keep a fairly trim figure through exercise, mostly running and kickboxing, and all the construction work. In addition to the snacks, she picked up a pair of flip-flops twirling on a rack near the door and a bag of cheese puffs for her driver, his request. She hopped back in the car and gnawed on her meat stick, watching the blocks pass by on the darkened streets. She wasn't familiar with that part of town, driving through rows of houses close together. Growing worried, Roxanne wondered where Owen was sending her. 2 blocks later the car turned right, and Roxanne began to notice more industrial buildings. Nothing too big, a couple of small warehouses, a body shop, a packing facility. The car slowed down around the corner and stopped in front of a building, or at least the space where a building had been. "Here you are," the driver said, popping an orange curl into his mouth. "Thanks," Roxanne said. "Look, wait for me, will ya? I'll pay you double to take me home. I'll just be a couple minutes." The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror and popped in another cheese puff. "Throw in the pretzels and we have a deal," he said. Roxanne tossed up the bag and opened the door to get out. When she walked up to the building, she noticed the char marks. Ash piled in the corners near where beams would have been. Roxanne could tell the place had burned. What did this have to do with her stolen permit? Why would Owen send her there? She didn't always follow Owen's logic. He'd been good to Roxanne and her dad over the years, giving her dad tips on construction jobs and even buying Roxanne some much-needed tools from time to time. He could be jovial and friendly with his patrons, and other times he'd throw out a guy if he didn't like his shirt. Lately, however, she could tell Owen didn't approve of her dad's recent gambling troubles. Looking around the burnt building, Roxanne couldn't decipher what she was supposed to be looking for. It seemed like the building had included some type of kitchen based on the partial countertops. There were lots of metal pipes, smashed and charred. In a lot of respects, the building looked like a small warehouse where a large batch of something was meant to be manufactured. When she pushed aside some of the rubble, she saw a small piece of aluminum, shining green with a clover leaf. Some kind of logo, she assumed. She picked up the jagged piece of aluminum and put it in her pocket. She'd ask Owen about it later. He wouldn't send her on a wild goose chase for nothing, and she was sure the clover logo was a key reason for sending her there. While she didn't know all that Owen was involved in, she knew he owned the hole in the wall, but most likely had some other investments. Otherwise, Owen was mostly an enigma. When she got back to the car, her driver was noshing on the pretzels. She gave him her address and sat back, the lights of the city glistening in the distance. Biting into her beef stick, she thought about what Owen had been trying to tell her. She tucked the piece of clover imprinted aluminum into her wallet. Tired from her long day, the alcohol making her sleepy, she slumped down in the seat. Finding who stole the permit would be her first priority. In the morning, as she rested her head against the seat cushion, an image came to mind: Tom's first little smirk. She grinned and closed her eyes, wanting to hold that vision in her memory. Maybe he was worth a second chance after all. After finding the permit, her next order of business would be to find out more about Tom. She wasn't sure which would be the harder challenge. Chapter 7: The Chase. The next morning, Roxanne slipped on a pair of brown leather boots, jeans, and a leopard print sweater. Animal prints made her feel fierce. She certainly needed a pick-me-up after things hadn't been going her way. She headed off to work, but first stopped by the local donut shop, which she did every so often to pick up a box of treats for her crew. That morning, after all the alcohol, she craved a sugar fix. After wolfing down a cinnamon-glazed donut before exiting the shop, she sighted a dark town car with tinted windows parked outside. Didn't her dad's loan shark get chauffeured around in a dark town car? She asked herself. Through the windows of the store she felt a little exposed. In her sweater, gulping down a donut, she didn't exactly blend in. Outside of the jungle, leopard prints are fairly noticeable. She hopped back in her car, threw the donuts on the front seat, and continued to drive to the construction site, looking behind her every so often. She planned to give her construction crew the donuts and ask around to see if anyone had seen a stranger near her trailer the day before. Adjusting the rearview mirror for the fourth time in her nervous state, she noticed the town car 2 cars back, following her. With every turn she made, the town car followed. Roxanne began to consider that the loan shark heard about her problem with the permit and wanted to give her an unpleasant warning, or worse. She continued to drive toward the freeway, testing the car to see if it was still pursuing her. When she saw a sign for the airport, she swerved into the exiting lane. The town car swerved too. Roxanne started to worry even more. Like Owen told her, she couldn't go to the police. They were very dangerous people her father was indebted to. She couldn't hide. They'd already seen her in her vibrant sweater, and if confronted, she couldn't lie. She needed to get away. She thought about ditching her car, parking it in a lot somewhere. But then what? She drove toward the arrival sign. People stood on the curb with their bags, many looking for their ride or checking their phones to see how long their mind-numbing wait at the airport would be. Seeing the bags made her remember when she had lost her luggage on a trip to Miami. She spent the night without her bag, and then it mysteriously showed up at the airport the next day. When she got it back, she swore her best hot pink undies were a bit stretched out, causing her to imagine a strong baggage handler prancing around his apartment in her bras and underpants. It got her to thinking how no one would miss a suitcase for a short time, especially if she returned it later. It wouldn't really be stealing, just borrowing for a little while. She circled around the airport, the town car still on her heels. The second time, she again followed the signs for arrivals. She stopped the car near the curb where she spied a baggage carousel nearby inside. With the car still idling, she ran into the airport, grabbed a suitcase with a bright pink ribbon tied to it, and hoisted it inside the car in what seemed like supersonic speed. She threw it on top of the donut box, squashing the myriad of jelly-filled treats. She could see the town car parked a few cars behind her. She continued to drive while looking in the bag, learning who she was going to be that day. Luckily, she spied a pair of black pants, a size too small, and a long caftan-like shirt in pale blue. It would have to do. She could suck it in, get the pants on, and throw on the top. She fumbled around looking for shoes, finally finding a pair of slippers. Although not ideal, they were probably better for a quick getaway than her bare feet from the night before. She pulled into a rental car parking lot and parked her vehicle in an empty numbered car stall. The town car parked nearby. She waited. When she saw the shuttle about to pull out, she ran to the door and gestured to get in at the last second. She thought she'd be safer in a crowded space. The loan shark's goons wouldn't hurt her in public. Despite not having a ticket to board a plane, she headed back to the airport, a tote bag with her disguise in hand. The shuttle pulled away. She could see the town car, but no one seemed to be in it. She hadn't noticed anyone getting on the shuttle after her. Taking a deep breath, she sat down, the bag on her lap. Once she arrived back at the airport, she scooted to a restroom and put on the unsuspecting traveler's clothes, including a pair of sunglasses she found in a side pocket. With her new disguise, she figured she'd be able to safely wait at the curb for a ride share. She'd have to get her car later, just in case the person in the town car was waiting back at the parking lot for her. Then she'd return the bag, claiming she picked up the wrong one by mistake. It would get back to its rightful owner in due time. She pressed the app to order her ride. After connecting, it instructed her to meet at arrivals G6. Like a bingo game, she set off to find G6. She still couldn't fathom how the loan shark had found out about the stolen permit already. She waited, clicking through her phone. 2 days in a row she found herself running from something. It wasn't a position she was used to. She normally liked to deal with things up front, and she didn't like feeling unsafe. While she waited, she thought of Tom and the cat. There was one thing Tom had forgotten to mention about the life of a feline. A cat might act like it didn't need anyone, but even a loud noise sent it scurrying. They were actually fairly skittish creatures, she believed, and she didn't envy the way they had to slink in the night. Being chased and scared that the loan shark and his men wanted to hurt her, she looked around nervously, ready to bolt if necessary. The night before, however, Tom had made her feel safe despite his awkward mannerisms, escorting her out, offering to drive, making sure she was safe in the car. After she stopped being chased and found out who stole the permit, she tried to weave Tom into a conversation with Danny, see if she might be able to find out how to contact him. It had been a long time since she'd asked someone out, and although Tom wasn't her usual type, she kept thinking about him, even when she was scared for her life. When she looked up to see if her ride was coming her way, she noticed the town car circling by, its windows dark so she couldn't see inside. Her first instinct was to run and hide. With her disguise, though, she considered, the car probably wouldn't notice her, so she stayed still and put her head down. The car pulled over just ahead of her, and she couldn't believe who stepped out of the back seat. Chapter 8, Hide and Seek. Tom, in his stiff and lanky manner, put both feet on the curb and stood up. He scanned the area, seeming to search for someone. It took Roxanne a moment to realize he was looking for her. But why? Couldn't he have just done what a normal person does and asked someone for her number? Why chase her? Despite being annoyed with him for terrifying her, Roxanne watched him and breathed a sigh of relief that the loan shark wasn't after her. Tom didn't see Roxanne standing in the crowd of people, waiting for their rides. Wearing a pale blue button-down shirt tucked into slim gray pants, he looked businesslike. He entered the airport and continued to scan the room, carefully turning his head slightly each second. Roxanne followed him and seethed. It had been Tom all along who had caused her undue panic, theft even. If she had known it was Tom following her, she would have stopped and offered him a donut. Watching him, she also couldn't help but be flattered. He was making a lot of effort to find her. Being that she thought Tom had some unusual social habits, she considered maybe he just didn't know how to ask a woman out. He clearly didn't know how to flirt. She watched as he walked back toward the entrance, and she observed a slight dip in his head, unusual that he wasn't standing straight. Although they stood only a few yards from each other with people passing between them, dragging their suitcases, chatting with one another, Tom didn't realize Roxanne was there. While a woman passed by carrying a cat in a travel carrier, Roxanne took note of the glistening in Tom's eyes as he followed the animal with his gaze. Perhaps he, too, was remembering the previous night's events. When Tom looked up from the carrier, there were no more people between them, and he finally noticed Roxanne. She took off the sunglasses, smiled and waved. He walked toward her briskly, and for a moment she thought he might embrace her like those airport reunions one sees in old movies, people hugging and kissing after being away from a long trip. Instead, he stopped abruptly in front of her and said, "Roxanne, you have on a different outfit." "Yeah, about that," she said, a little perturbed that her dream scenario hadn't panned out. Obviously, Tom wasn't a grand romantic gesture type of guy. In fact, she couldn't even be sure he had a romantic interest in her at all. "Why were you following me?" she asked. "You could have easily just come up to me and said hello in the donut shop." She looked at him, becoming more infuriated that he didn't show any remorse or any sort of expression at all on his face. "And while we're at it," she continued, "I got so scared I felt like I had no choice but to steal a disguise." He looked at her close. "And now my donuts are all smashed." She took a step closer, her anger rising even higher. "I had something important to do today. But you freaked me out, following me in that town car of yours." She raised her finger at him. "I don't like to be scared away like that cat you took a fancy to last night." Tom stood still and listened to her rant. When she finished, his eyes closed and opened in a slow blink before he said, "I'm sorry. Can we go somewhere to talk?" "That's all you're going to say?" she spat, trying to straighten her body, looking up at Tom. "I'll explain. Let me take you to a coffee shop." She studied his expression and saw that it actually softened a bit. "Okay, but first you need to take me to my car so I can get Gladys' suitcase and return it. And then you're buying me some more donuts." She slung the bag holding her original outfit over her shoulder and proceeded toward the door. Who's Gladys? He asked, following. That's all you're worried about? She stopped, looked back, rolled her eyes and shook her head. Gladys is the name I made up for the woman whose suitcase I stole. Right now she's probably frantically looking for her beige slippers. Tom's eyes followed Roxanne's down to her feet as he took a step next to her. You have the worst luck with footwear, he said. Roxanne tried not to laugh, noticing Tom's still face as if he was just pointing out the obvious, but she couldn't hold it in. She laughed despite her anger, and the release of emotion made her feel a little more relaxed. Okay, let's go, she said and grabbed his arm. He looked down at the place where she touched him, almost looking at her hand on his arm as if it were a strange growth. As she pulled him to follow her, he extended his arm and her hand slid down to his wrist. He clasped her hand so as not to lose her in the crowd. Roxanne smiled at him, feeling a supple tenderness in his hand but also his protectiveness. Tom smirked back. Together, they walked down the sidewalk to the town car where Tom's driver was waiting. After Roxanne retrieved her car, changed back into her clothes and returned the suitcase, she followed Tom's town car to a coffee shop not far from the airport. They sat down at a table across from one another. You have some explaining to do, she said to Tom once the waitress had taken their order. I saw you at the donut shop, yes. I didn't approach you there because I got hung up on a phone call. And then I thought I'd just catch up with you at your place of employment. Roxanne considered his story. Seemed plausible. Weird but plausible. Why did you follow me to the donut shop in the first place? She asked, leaning forward and placing her chin in her hands. I wanted to make sure you were okay. I was worried. Tom sat straight as he normally did, but she could see him fiddling with his hands in his lap. But once you saw that I was okay, you could have just turned around. Why keep following me? I wanted to talk to you. Like I said, I missed my window. Yeah, due to that ultra-secret phone call. Roxanne leaned back in her chair. She wanted answers, but more importantly, she wanted to see Tom break from his usual stiff and in-control demeanor. The waitress delivered their coffees. Once she stepped away from their table, Tom leaned in closer and lowered his voice. I know what kind of trouble you're in. Roxanne looked around. She wasn't sure exactly what Tom meant or how much he knew, but the more he spoke, the more she believed he hadn't been following her due to any romantic feelings. I don't know what you're talking about, she said and crossed her arms, feeling disappointed Tom had sought her out purely for business. I know, Roxanne. I know about your father's debt. I know about the stolen permit. Roxanne started tapping her foot, her anxiety escalating. So that's why you were following me. You're in on it. She pointed at Tom. No. I had nothing to do with it, but I can help. His rigid body looked unyielding, as if he wore a coat of armor that made it hard to move, but she didn't want a knight in shining armor at that moment. She wanted to be independent. I don't need your help. Roxanne's frustration built. She realized Tom hadn't wanted to ask her out. He was following her because of some business deal. She didn't want to be treated like a lost child. She was handling her own issues. As far as she was concerned, Tom was just getting in the way. You don't know what happened to that permit. Danny told me how important it is to the construction timeline. If you can't get it back, your investors won't be happy, Tom said. Roxanne stared at him, her mind puzzling to figure out how Tom knew all that information. Sometimes he seemed so clueless, uttering the wrong things, and other times he knew exactly the most cunning thing to say. I can do it on my own. I was fine until you showed up throwing me off course. If it hadn't been for you, you'd be standing around with a bunch of construction guys and a box of donuts, he finished. She scowled at the way he belittled her plan. How did he know? He was a lot more perceptive than she gave him credit for. You can forget all that, he said. I'll pay your father's debt to the loan shark. Oh, my knight in shining armor, Roxanne said in a high-pitched voice as she brought her hands to her neck. I don't do the damsel in distress act. I don't know how you know about the debt, but I'm working on paying that back. She took a sip of coffee. On my own. You won't be able to pay it back if you don't get that permit because then you won't have a job. It will delay things and the investors might not make as much money. They might come after you for that too. Drop the savior routine. You knew the permit was stolen and that my father is in debt to a really scary man, and you thought it would be a good idea to follow me in a strange car. My SUV is getting detailed. Roxanne took another sip of her coffee, while Tom hadn't even touched his yet. She couldn't understand why he offered explanations to the mundane questions without answering what she truly wanted to know. Of course. That explains it. She threw up her hands. I told you why I was following you. That's why I came to check on you once I found out. Roxanne took a deep breath, trying to understand the situation. Let's say I believe that you had the best of intentions when you trailed me to the donut shop. Then this mysterious phone call. And now this conversation. It still doesn't explain why you want to help me. Of course I'd need something in return, he said and finally brought the mug to his mouth. Even the way he swallowed looked automated and mechanical. Well, as I'm sure you found out in your exhaustive research about me, I don't have much to offer, so I don't see how it's going to work. She continued to tap her foot, the caffeine starting to ignite her even more. Tom smiled, the biggest grin Roxanne had seen on his face to date, even bigger than the moment he spied the cat. You have exactly what I need, he said. Chapter 9, Family Ties. Roxanne frowned. What could he want from her? He'd been such a gentleman in their previous meetings, shaking her hand, pulling out her chair, helping her to the door. She hoped he wasn't gross like Baxter. The last time a man suggested an exchange with Roxanne, he had only wanted one thing, her body. What's that? She asked. She was tired of rolling through the options in her head. I need you to have my baby. Roxanne looked at him in shock. Her mouth hung open. So he did want her body. What did he mean, have his baby? She thought Baxter was forward. This was a whole other level. She laughed and shook her head. That's some way to get in a girl's pants. I know you're a little odd, but maybe ask me on a date first. She joked. It's not like that. He shook his head, starting to show signs of frustration. Look, I told you I'm trying to break out on my own without my parents. Well, I have this opportunity, but I found out the landowner will only sell the property to a family man. So it's not personal, a baby. It's business. She eyed him closely to gauge his reaction. Yes, Tom nodded his head and then realized his mistake. No, not all business. Usually I'd take offense to someone calling me odd, but you're right. I don't always do well with women. He broke her stare and looked down at the table. You don't say, Roxanne said and chuckled. A baby though, that's a big deal. A real big deal. That just doesn't go away once you get your land deal. I know. He looked up straight in Roxanne's eyes to show he meant his words. I'd love to be a dad. I want a child. You wouldn't have to do anything. Just have the baby. I'll take care of the rest. You can't just swoop in with your money. A child is serious. It needs love, warmth, hugs, she said. I know. Tom lowered his head in a sullen gesture. I didn't get a lot of that growing up. You don't say. Roxanne quipped again. Hear me out. He raised his eyes to her. You're young. You're healthy. I know you're close with your dad. That's why I chose you. There are a lot of desperate women I could have propositioned. Roxanne sat up straighter, her mouth agape. I'm not desperate. Sure, but just think about it. I help you. You help me. Would we raise the child together? What happens to the baby? She asked. She couldn't believe she was actually considering this idea. I'll raise it. I'll do it all. After you give birth, you can go back to your life as you know it. Think about it more like being a surrogate. You could hire a surrogate then, why me? But I still need someone to pretend to be my family so I can get the land. So that's it. I need to pretend to be a happy couple with you. Have your baby and then walk away. Tom nodded. Now you've got it. He looked satisfied, as if he'd stolen a piece of candy and gotten away with it. Tom, a baby is serious. What makes you think I could just walk away? She looked hurt. In their exchanges so far, Tom had returned his answers fairly quickly. This time he took a moment to think about how to answer Roxanne, his mind working while his body remained still. He looked like he was considering her argument. Don't take this the wrong way, but I think you'd be great for this job. You have a good relationship with your father. I heard you were close, and then at the bar I saw your bond. That's what I want. Roxanne looked at him skeptically. Since you know so much, you know my mother walked away. I would never do that. Okay then. I'll amend the agreement. You don't have to walk away. It's up to you. We can both raise the child. He scooched back in his chair a little, finally placing his long hands around his mug and taking a sip. Roxanne pondered what Tom had said so far. She knew he'd be able to financially care for a child, and he had good manners, but would Tom be able to be flexible enough to be a father? Could she really do something so crazy? I'm not sure this is such a good idea. She pointed to Tom and then to herself. Roxanne, you could use some help. Like I told you, I know what kind of trouble you're in. I have connections. These people aren't going to wait for their money. Roxanne remembered her days languishing on her father's couch without a job. She thought about the loan shark, and how he threatened to hurt her father if their deal didn't go well. At the same time, she fought the notion that she needed a man to swoop in and rescue her. She was too proud for that. I'm independent, Roxanne said, and Tom nodded. I don't need you to save me. If we're going to do this, then you can't just pay off the debt. What is it that you need? I need to find out who stole that permit. Deal, said Tom and flashed Roxanne a huge grin. Seeing his smile made her believe she had made the right decision. Tom held out his hand over the table for a handshake, his hand looking like a rigid piece of wood. She hesitated, then brought her hand to meet Tom's. Like the first time they shook hands, his hand enveloped hers, feeling soft and warm. Her heart fluttered from nervousness. Roxanne floated through her workday, having trouble concentrating on her actual job, instead replaying her conversation with Tom. What had she done? Why had she agreed to such desperate measures? She considered calling up Tom and backing out. Somehow his smile had hypnotized her, she thought. And then she'd remember her predicament, how she was no closer to finding out how the permit disappeared. After work she drove to her father's place where he was watching the Grizzlies game on TV, eating leftover pizza. Roxanne grabbed a slice and a soda from the fridge and sat down next to him. How's it going? She asked. Just swell, he said. She laughed, thinking about how many phrases she used because her father said them too. I'm just so glad you're working again, he continued. It makes me happy. Everything going okay at work? Roxanne looked over and saw her father's usual jovial grin on his face. Then he groaned, getting up from the couch, walking back toward the refrigerator. She noticed how frail he was becoming, how hard it was for him to move. Yeah, why? Oh, no reason. Just heard from the loan shark. A warning about staying on time. Getting the building done. I got the message through Owen. Just wanted to make sure everything was all right with you. She heard the air release once her father opened his beer can. It's fine, Dad, Roxanne said, panicking a little that others might know about the missing permit. She hoped Tom's connections could work fast. I heard about this horse that Joey said was a sure thing, her father said, walking back to his seat on the couch. No, Dad, she said, cutting him off. I've got it all handled. I know, dear, he said, struggling to sit down. I just don't want you working too hard. I can contribute. Otherwise it's going to take forever to pay off my debt. My grandkids will be paying it. He chuckled. She turned to look him sternly in the face. Dad, I've got it covered. No more bets. I have another way. It's going to be fine. Her father smiled and patted her on the leg. Roxanne leaned back and took a sip of her soda. She had to go through with Tom's deal to protect her dad. It was the first time Roxanne had heard her father mention having grandkids. Little did he know, if things worked out with Tom, he'd become a grandpa soon enough. It was all about creating one life to save. Chapter 10: The Heiress. After Roxanne hadn't heard from Tom in a few days, she started to worry. He told her he'd have people look into the missing permit, and she should be patient. But with the loan shark whispering warnings to her father, she grew increasingly anxious. She had been looking into some materials invoices at work when she received a text from Tom. What are you wearing today? He asked. She couldn't believe he was starting the conversation with that. They hadn't been intimate at all, and here he was asking about her clothing. How are you? Boxers or briefs? Perhaps I should explain. Yes, do. I need you to accompany me to a formal dinner. You'll need dress attire. Should be in question form. Please. Don't have formal attire. I'll send some over. And shoes. Near the end of the workday, a long box arrived via courier. Most of the guys had quit for the day and were on their way home, so Roxanne knew she was alone. She pulled out a beautiful blue dress, soft and flowing. Taking off her jeans and sweatshirt, and putting on the dress, she felt out of place in the grubby trailer bathroom. The dress almost reached the floor in the back, but came up a little higher in the front. It wasn't particularly fancy, just not something Roxanne normally wore. She adjusted her hair in order to highlight her décolletage and thought she looked different, but rather attractive. There were no shoes in the box, so she kept on her brown construction boots. She laughed at the juxtaposition, her dirty dusty boots against the clean vibrant fabric. About an hour later, she heard a light knock on the trailer door. She opened it to find Tom standing there in a tailored navy blue suit with a red pattern tie. He looked suave. His gaze traveled down her body until it reached her feet. It will have to do except for that, he said, pointing to her boots. It wasn't exactly the response she was looking for. He wanted her to have his baby, the least he could do was compliment her. Did he even consider her attractive? I kind of like it, she said, kicking up part of the fabric with her boot. I forgot. Let me get the shoes in the car. Tom scampered back to his white SUV and retrieved a shoebox. Returning to the trailer, He entered to find Roxanne sitting on a chair, taking off her boots. When she finished, Tom knelt down and took a cream-colored heel out of the box and placed it on her foot. Unlike Cinderella, it didn't quite fit. It was a size or so too large, but Roxanne knew she could manage. She slipped her foot in the other shoe and stood up. When she wobbled a little, unused to such high heels, Tom offered her his arm. He looked her over and nodded. She felt pleased he'd finally offered her a gesture of approval. Together, they descended the stairs to the SUV, their attractive crisp attire a contrast to the earthy construction site in the distance. The restaurant was located in an old part of Memphis where several wealthy families owned estates. Inside, tufted high-backed chairs encircled tables covered with pure white tablecloths. Tom, ever the gentleman, pulled out Roxanne's chair, then introduced her to Ruby, a wealthy heiress Tom knew from high school. Ruby, a petite blonde with blue eyes, greeted them at the table. "How are y'all?" she asked, looking eagerly at Roxanne. "Fine," Tom said in his perfunctory way as he unbuttoned his suit jacket while sitting down. Roxanne smiled, unsure what to say. Tom had prepared her a little in the car, telling her how he knew Ruby and how she found herself suddenly in charge of her family's estate, which included substantial land holdings around Memphis. When Tom mentioned he was dating someone, I told him to bring her on over. "I'm so gosh darn excited to meet ya," Ruby said, smiling Roxanne's way. "Thank you," said Roxanne because she wasn't sure how else to respond. When the waiter came by and asked for their drink order, Tom and Ruby both ordered Chardonnay, while Roxanne ordered a vodka rocks. Tom flashed her a look that suggested she'd made the wrong choice, but she knew she needed the hard stuff to get her through the dinner. A little liquid courage might help her mask how uncomfortable she felt in a fancy restaurant with two old-school chums. As Ruby and Tom discussed people they knew from high school, Ruby doing most of the talking, Roxanne perused the menu. She couldn't believe some of the prices. $50 for a hamburger? $125 for the porterhouse? "So how did you all meet?" Ruby asked. In contrast to Tom, she seemed to be perpetually grinning. "Well," Tom said, looking toward Roxanne. "Actually, we met on a construction site." Roxanne jumped in. "Wow, that's fascinating. Are you in real estate too?" Ruby asked Roxanne. "You could say that," answered Tom. By the time their entrees arrived, Ruby and Tom were still talking about people they knew in common, eventually circling around to real estate conversations. Tom asked about Ruby's landholdings, trying not to pry too much. Roxanne could tell he wanted more details, but Ruby spoke fairly vaguely about the properties, being much more excited to rehash old high school gossip. Roxanne bit into her hamburger, accidentally squirting a speck of ketchup on her dress and tried to wipe it off with a napkin. After that, she ate the burger with a knife and fork, cutting it into little pieces. While it tasted good, she thought about how the people she knew would laugh at her for her proper etiquette. She looked around, feeling oddly out of place, but all the other customers were consumed with their own conversations. She didn't enter into the discussion with Ruby and Tom, in part because she didn't know the people Ruby was discussing and also because she found the conversation dull and vapid. Talking about professional sports or construction was more her style. Roxanne fidgeted in her seat, silently brooding. She ordered another vodka despite the stink-eye Tom gave her, and before she realized it, she finished it while Ruby discussed her latest vacation. Roxanne couldn't have felt more out of place and neglected, Tom clearly unable or unwilling to include her in his conversation with Ruby. While Tom had, again, barely touched his wine, Ruby was on her third glass, chatting away and smiling like a true Southern debutante. Tom's gaze remained firmly on Ruby, Roxanne noticed, as if he enjoyed letting her do the work of talking as he answered in one or two words, which didn't seem to ruffle Ruby at all. Perhaps she was used to Tom's stiffness, or she didn't notice, too busy yammering on about her acquaintances and travel. Roxanne stayed silent, stewing, feeling like a rusty third wheel to Ruby and Tom's chummy high school duo. When the waiter passed by their table again, she ordered another vodka. "Thanks, but that won't be needed," Tom said to the waiter. The waiter looked at Roxanne for her agreement. "But darling," she said to Tom, trying to lay on the charm like Ruby, "you know how I like to take the edge off." Ruby smiled nervously. Emboldened by Tom's attempt to control her, she grabbed his hand and folded her fingers into his. Tom nodded at the waiter, who retreated. Roxanne wasn't sure if that meant he was bringing her a vodka or not. Ruby looked unsure about the situation herself, giggled, then sipped her wine. Surprising to Roxanne, Tom didn't try to let go of her hand. He held her hand delicately, and while the rest of his body remained rigid, his hand in hers felt loose and relaxed. When the third vodka was delivered, Roxanne took a sip, but left the rest in the glass. It was her signal that she'd won the battle and didn't need to go any further. As the three stood up to leave, Ruby came in fast for a hug from Tom and then turned to Roxanne for a quick embrace. Roxanne patted Ruby's back awkwardly, being uncomfortable with such affection from a woman she just met. Then Ruby turned to Tom and told him they should meet again soon. She needed some real estate advice. She was looking to sell some land and was hoping he could help. That's when Roxanne grew angry. At the suggestion that Ruby may want to unload some properties, Tom's face lit up like a winning slot machine. Catching. Roxanne could practically see Tom dreaming about the huge pile of cash he could make if only he could convince Ruby to let him develop her land. And while she knew she was there for a business deal, she couldn't shake the feeling that Tom was using both of them solely to profit. She felt out of place in such a fine restaurant, talking to a woman who, while chipper, seemed to be more interested in rumors, but most of all, she felt out of place with Tom. His gentlemanly manners were starting to irk her because they felt fake. He hadn't even complimented her on how pretty she looked in the new dress. So when Tom offered her his arm to walk out, Roxanne grabbed it and clenched his bicep as hard as she could. She didn't expect what happened next.